All right, well, good morning, everyone. So I'm Greg Coralla with AWS. I lead our business development team for analytics, and joining me today is Naveen from Cisco. I'll kind of go through his introduction here in a minute, but today's session is going to be on building a data lake on AWS, and so we can debate like the definition of data lake, but for our purposes, we'll think about how do we gather the most value from the data we have, right? And we'll go through some examples. And we'll kind of start off with, kind of the AWS perspective, maybe just, 10 minutes or so, just so we kind of, some of the terminology is familiar, some of the web services that we have to build a data lake and architectural frameworks that we see customers apply. And then, majority of the session then will be Naveen talking about how at Cisco they've implemented many of these capabilities and some of the value and how they did it and some more details on that side. So, and then we'll have time at the end for questions, and then, we'll be in the hallway afterwards as well if we do run over in time. But I think, to kind of start things out is, why customers typically come to us asking, hey, we've got problems in terms of, exploring the data, analyzing data, it's difficult to assemble, it becomes cost prohibitive. Hopefully, at least some of these bullet points resonate with those in the audience where maybe we have like fixed infrastructure on premise and we want to be more flexible and more, so we want to think about how do we drive innovation by the analytics and kind of insights that our analysts want to really maximize the value of the data that's available. And so starting, I think, 4 years back, we saw this whole evolution of cloud adoption and thinking about not just compute and storage as a service or capability that I can, pay for what I use, turn off when not needed, but now moving into a place where we want to think about a data warehouse as a service, right? Where I have analytical queries, I have Tableau reports and dashboards that are being driven off, fundamentally large data sets, and I need high performance and scalability. And historically, if you kind of match back to that previous slide, whether I'm come from on-premise data warehouse, these were, cost prohibitive, inflexible, had to think about capacity planning, purchasing hardware. And really, 4 years back, what Redshift brought, I think, to data warehouse market was, simply turning a data warehouse on in a matter of minutes, right? Going from a few hundred gigabytes to petabytes and beyond, maybe in an hour, right? And then being able to say, look, I know I have a set amount of data today, and I can just start small, then grow. Then maybe if it's end of month reporting, I can add capacity in. First of the month, I can pull that back. And so the idea of innovative price points. So, if you kind of follow data warehousing metrics, sometimes we use this, dollars per terabyte per year metric. And so Redshift, generally can be, less than $1,000 per terabyte per year. That's not how customers pay for it. You pay by the hour, just pay for what you use. But kind of some of this idea that I can have all the capabilities of a massively parallel processing data warehouse, but at a price point and with automation such that critical things like patching and backups and availability and disaster recovery are all just part of the data warehouse, right? And so, going back 4 years, customers said, hey, let's think about moving a data warehouse to AWS, and oftentimes Redshift became the place where customers started in terms of this journey for analytics. And it's kind of been validated by not just, startups, so we kind of started off with like Lyft and these companies that maybe didn't have an IT staff, right? They simply wanted to turn a data warehouse on and have a price point that was, really super compelling for them to adopt faster. But over time, we saw, there was a lot of commonality between what some of these startups wanted to do for analytics and maybe what, enterprise customers wanted to do, right? So, NASDAQ was one of the first adopters of Redshift, and they moved from on-premise data warehouse to Redshift and able to meet their compliance, security, audit, encryption controls, all having the most sensitive financial data in a Redshift data warehouse, right? If you look at being able to run mission-critical applications, this is something that Redshift has had from day one. But the idea still was, for the most part, thinking about analytics and driving value out of data, I was able to, move to the cloud, be faster, lower cost, more agile, but I was kind of this idea of loading data into the data warehouse, transforming it. Customers started looking, are there ways we can now expand the analytic capability, right? And this has been, validated by, to the extent you look at third-party analysts and thinking about this adoption of the cloud for analytics. And so, as I'm sure most people in the room are kind of familiar with AWS story, so I kind of didn't do the basics in terms of AWS, but in terms of analytics and cloud data warehouse, we don't disclose actual adoption numbers, but if you look at some reports from Forrester and Gartner, so Forrester will call out over 5,000 customers globally run production workloads on Redshift today, right? Everything from hundreds of gigabytes out to NTT Docomo in Japan, who takes all their call detail records, about 16 petabytes of data. After compression is about 3 petabytes in a single Redshift cluster, right? And so, thinking about what FINRA does in terms of financial regulatory market, what Cardinal Health does in terms of being able to take a lot of their legacy data warehouses and derive value. So there's lots of customers that have, adopted Redshift at pretty significant ways. And one of the things I typically call out is that, one of the unique pieces of AWS is we don't just provide services for our customers to use. We actually have a pretty big internal customer that uses AWS as well. You might be familiar with Amazon.com retail. And so our retail team moved, about 18 petabyte Oracle RAC database to Redshift. And there's lots of other case studies we can go through. But whether you're starting with small data or up to massive amounts of data, this idea of having a data warehouse became, really, really compelling for many customers. And then, we get asked, okay, that sounds great, and this isn't really meant to be like a Redshift deep dive. We have a hands-on workshop at 3 o'clock if you're interested in some of the details, but, what if I have, a data warehouse today? Like, how do I move, right? And how can we have a set of services to help accelerate that migration? And so we have something called database migration service and schema conversion tool that helps you unlock data maybe from proprietary data stores or from existing on-premise infrastructure. And some customers will say, well, we want to move all in on Redshift. And others say, look, maybe there's a new project or we want to combine data. So there's definitely a hybrid approaches as well. But Redshift is its own database, right? And knowing the schema and kind of the access patterns. And so schema conversion tool can kind of look at what you're doing in, let's say, Oracle and recommend a starting point for the schema in Redshift, right? And then actually move the data into Redshift as well. So there's still some, it's not like, I just push a button and everything works, but the tooling is there to kind of help accelerate that migration as well. But really, I think really kind of what the main topic we wanted to cover and dive into is that this idea that I have one store for analytics, even with Redshift became, limiting for many customer use cases, right? And in historical sense, we all kind of, my personal background was at Oracle, and look, database vendors built out this rich set of features in the database, right? And, one of the conversations we have with customers, well, if you're relying on, one thing for analytics, then I'm basically limited on how quickly that vendor can iterate on features, right? And essentially putting your eggs in one basket, right, is maybe a different analogy. And what we saw, this is something that FINRA does, it's something that NASDAQ does, it's what Netflix does, it's, we'll talk, Naveen to talk about his case study with Sysco, but increasingly S3 becomes the landing spot for data, right? Whether it's a file, if it's a stream of data, if it's a transaction, right? Many ways to get data into S3. There's other data sources as well. Maybe I have relational databases, that might have, data and schemas in it. Then customers said, well, okay, if I'm, assembling my data on S3, how does a tool that's expecting a table to write a query, how does that tool know that I have data on S3 and there's actually a table, right? And so hopefully most people in the audience are familiar with the concept of a Hive metastore, right? So, but the idea of establishing a Hive metastore and having a durable back end for it, there's definitely patterns and access ways that we can point you to, but we said, hey, what if we make this super simple and you just have a data catalog? And we didn't want to get too complex in terms of AWS naming, so we just called it the AWS Glue Data Catalog, right? And so fundamentally, the Glue Data Catalog provides this full Hive Metastore API. So you can drag in or drop in replacement for your existing Hive Metastore, but now it's just a service that AWS offers, right? And from we make it pretty compelling from a price perspective. So your first 1 million objects that the catalog stores, so it doesn't move data, it just has the schema, the information. So your first 1 million objects are free. Every 1 million objects on top of that are $1 per month, right? And in addition to just having this Hive Metastore as a service, it introduces something called crawlers. And so crawlers can actually, with the appropriate security rights, if you know AWS called IAM roles, can go out and look at buckets of data in S3. You can go out and look at your SQL Server database, your MySQL database, and come back with a schema, right? And so the idea of teaching analysts to know Hive DDL, I mean, it's not impossible, but maybe the barrier in terms of getting started is a little bit high. So now, whether it's an action in terms of file landing into S3, if it's an event, such as, a Lambda function that triggers the crawler, or just time, you can now, automate these crawlers to come back with the schema in the Hive Metastore, right? And then it turns out, for analytics perspective, the data format matters, right? So if I have like a terabyte CSV, and if I'm using Tableau and I do equivalent of select star in my report, well, querying a CSV, I think we can all agree, is maybe not the most performant. And this is where, other interesting development in ecosystem is around these open data formats, right? And by that I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with Apache Hadoop and Apache MySQL, but if you've heard about data formats like Parquet or ORC or Avro, even JSON, right? And the idea is that, over time in the Hadoop ecosystem, there's been these columnar formats that, actually are performant for analytics, right? And the value of that now becomes, I'm not locking my data into proprietary data store. So yes, you can still ETL data into Redshift, but more and more, this idea of as soon as I transform the data into a proprietary data store, then again, I'm in that previous bucket where I'm limited by the innovation that vendor can drive through its features and functions, right? And there's some reasons why you still might do that, because we still live have to match this up in reality in terms of cost-based optimizer and how they perform at joins, and all the reason that local disk still works best. But increasingly, this idea of S3 as your data lake with 11 nines of durability, right? We copy data across 3 separate facilities or data centers behind the scenes for you, but you just pay for 1 copy of it, right? You're not paying the 3x replication tax of HDFS, and not just having any file in S3, but an open file format, right? And then having the Glue data catalog or the idea of Hive Metastore to define that data, then to help transform data. So if I have CSV and I want to go to Parquet, other component of Glue is actually an execution engine for transformations. And again, we didn't want to build yet another new component, so we simply provide a serverless Spark container. And essentially, it's a component of Glue billed by the second. So now, to the extent your people that are doing data transformations come from more coding background, and they want to write Python code, but you want a super simple way to execute that Python code without having to think about a cluster or server, you can use the Glue execution engine to basically transform this data and automate it, of course, right? So once the data kind of gets into this, open formats, whether, we're not tied to one particular, customers kind of can choose. We want to have a broad support across many, whether it's Parquet or ORC or others. But now the power is that I have this flexible set of web services, right, to be able to match the use case of the analyst to the set of data, right? And oftentimes, maybe half joke, we're not like Amazon Web Product, we're Amazon Web Services, right? And so knowing that I have this flexible set of web services that I can tailor for my use case becomes incredibly powerful, right? And so a few examples. Imagine I do have a data warehouse where I'm using Tableau reports and the schema is known, the access patterns are fairly well known, the joins are complex such that I need a cost-based optimizer, I need everything a relational database does. Well, you can use Redshift, right? And if I have other data on S3, I can use a new feature of Redshift called Spectrum, that essentially I can create an external table on the Redshift database, but that table doesn't actually reside in the Redshift database, it resides on S3, right, defined through the data catalog. And the query execution for that data in S3 is not my local Redshift cluster, it's the serverless compute pool that can flex based upon whether I need 1 node, 10 nodes, 100 nodes, 1,000 nodes, right? That's transparent to you as an administrator or a user, but you simply know I have data on S3 and I can query it. And so we gave an example at our AWS San Francisco Summit where we queried in real time a full exabyte of data on S3, right? So we replicated some Amazon retail data, ran a very complex query against a full exabyte of data that returned in less than 2 minutes and cost less than $200 to run, right? So kind of groundbreaking, right? But now if I think about data warehousing workloads, well, what's another type of workload that is primarily driven through SQL? And I'll kind of call out this idea of data discovery. And by that I mean, this is new data, it's log data, the analyst wants to explore it, right? Maybe that hasn't been transformed or loaded into a particular schema. And so we thought about this and said, well, instead of having just Redshift expanded to do that, let's think about a different service, and we call that Athena, right? So Athena is about a super simple way. It's a completely serverless infrastructure. There's no cluster to turn on. There's no configuration settings. You simply have an analyst that knows SQL, data defined in the same data catalog with the files sitting on S3 that now you can just write SQL against, right? And this idea of, I have maybe call them data scientists as defined by people who know SQL, don't have to impact your production reporting, don't have to think about workload management, those things. You simply can give them access to Athena, and they can just query the data as needed. And particularly where data is primarily at rest, where it doesn't make sense to load it into a data warehouse, I can just explore it now through SQL. And we provide this through Athena, right? But then think about a real data, not real data, but a different data scientist who wants to program Python, right? Or they're using R, they're using Spark containers, they're using Zeppelin or Jupyter notebooks, where all the power of Apache Hadoop ecosystem needs to be applied. And so now they can leverage Amazon EMR, right? Which provides the full Apache Hadoop distribution, but doesn't tie you to HDFS. It actually uses S3 as the data layer, right? And so now you can have multiple clusters running against the same data. I can use auto-scaling groups to move up and down, right? I can have now per second billing with EMR, right? So simply, if I have a job that runs for 3 minutes and 10 seconds, I just pay for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. But it has the full richness of Apache Hadoop without the overhead of HDFS, right? And if I look at some of the case studies like FINRA and NASDAQ and some others, they'll find this idea of using S3, using separation of compute and storage for Apache Hadoop workloads makes sense. And then what ties it together is that from the analyst perspective now, you simply have your Tableau reports and dashboards. You can provision them into the right set of services that match their use case, right? Whether it's data exploration through Spark, if it's data warehousing or data discovery. But again, this cost, flexibility, innovation really helps drive the use case, and not saying, hey, we spent $1 million on this thing, therefore everything has to go into that, right? And so decoupling compute and storage, thinking about open data formats on S3, then having teams collaborating on the same data, using a set of services that make sense for their use case, both on functionality and cost, but more importantly, not being tied into the life cycle of a particular thing, right? To be able to have, how do I drive innovation? Well, I'm allowed experimentation. Experimentation, of course, means failure in some cases, right? So can I make the cost of failure super low that I can turn services on, turn them off, and then if something is great for production, I can scale it out, right? And so this whole idea of iterative approach becomes really a key driver to what many customers find attractive about looking at the AWS ecosystem for analytics. And this is kind of like my last kind of overview slide before we get to Naveen. And then, we can't just do this in the ecosystem of, hey, there's a set of AWS services. We also have a rich partner ecosystem, right? So if I'm using SnapLogic, or I'm using Talend, or Informatica, or Matillion for ETL, right? If I'm using, different ways to explore or analyze data, knowing that there's this rich marketplace and partner ecosystem that can, match your capabilities and skill sets into the same framework, but inheriting the security, compliance, and access controls such that, customers store their most sensitive data on AWS. And if you're familiar with one of our large financial services customers that's been public, the CIO of Capital One called out that AWS is more secure than Capital One data centers were previously, right? And this idea that the most sensitive of data can be stored in AWS and analyzed as needed. So that's kind of at least the overview. So I wanted to provide a perspective in terms of how we think about data lake and analytics, but moving beyond just kind of the PowerPoint and overview slide. So we invited Naveen to come talk about how Sysco has actually implemented many of these and the lessons learned and value by taking a real world use case and having a discussion on that.
Can you guys hear me? I can hear myself. Thank you, Greg. I'll introduce myself real quick and then jump into some of the content. And I apologize up front. I'm recovering from a cold, and I might need to take a few water breaks here. So getting into this, right, some of the challenges that Greg alluded to earlier, we had none of those. Sysco had the best-of-breed landscape from a data and analytics perspective, but we did not have a data lake. So that's what got us into this thing. We wanted to build a data lake. No reaction. No, that was not it. We had all of the challenges and then some at Sysco. We had a very fragmented data landscape. We had tons of upstream systems. We did not really have enterprise-wide visibility across our data. That's where we started looking at what's our alternative. Our data strategy at that point in time was extremely nascent at best. We were starting to think through what our enterprise analytics looked like or would look like in 3 years. And we had a plan that we had talked to the street about. To be able to support our plan, we had to start looking at, I'm going the wrong way. We had to start looking at insights. So before we jump into the analytics and all the cool stuff of technology that Greg kind of alluded to, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about what Sysco is. We are the global leader in food distribution. If you guys have eaten at a restaurant this week, you've stayed at a hotel, which you guys probably are, traveled in on a plane, your kids eat at schools, healthcare facilities, the ingredients that go into the food that you guys are eating most likely went through our supply chain. We have about 500,000 customers that we serve across 13 global countries. We are about $55 billion in revenue. We're located, headquartered in Houston, but we've got operations across the continental US as well as globally. One other key fact about Sysco, a fun fact, is we actually own one of the largest fleets of tractor trucks in the US. About 9,600 plus tractor trucks, and these are all custom designed. They have different temperature zones for us to be able to deliver fresh produce all the way to frozen goods in one shipping drop. So that's us. One of the key things that I want to call out on this slide as well is the fact that Sysco over the years, we were founded in 1969. One of the key things that has happened since then is we've kind of grown organically through acquisitions, inorganically rather through acquisitions rather than organically just upping our overall top line revenue. So given that, our enterprise strategy, our systems have been very disparate. So we've actually had to deal with trying to get data from different sources every time we acquire a new company. We haven't really addressed that well up until the point that we started looking at building a data ecosystem. So before we get into the technology pieces, I'll give you a little bit of context about our plan and why the need for a data lake and an enterprise data analytics strategy was key. So the motivation was our 3-year plan. In 2015, we kind of talked to the street about our goals to provide $500+ million in operating income and about a 15% return on capital invested across our business to our customers and our stakeholders and our shareholders. The key enablers to achieving that strategy, right from the get-go, our leadership team identified technology and the people that were supporting that technology to be playing a really key component and a key part in us achieving those goals. And if you break technology down, the analytics and the data insights that were required across the enterprise, not just siloed analytics at one line of business or one particular component at our operating company, it needed to be a broader swath of data that we looked at to be able to achieve our plan. So the foundation for the need for a new data ecosystem stemmed from the fact that we had a plan that we had committed to the street, and we now needed to kind of break this down. And as all of you guys probably know, the devil's in the detail, right? How do you break this down to what the next level of componentization for, how do I support this with the data that we already have? So that's where we started looking at our landscape and some of the challenges that existed in our landscape. These are extremely similar to what Greg talked about. I suspect a lot of you struggle with some of these challenges as well. If we looked at our landscape, we had a big gap in terms of analytical capabilities. We were a very row and column-based reporting organization. When I took the role over a few years ago, we burst out about 100,000 plus reports every week, row and column reports, to our organization. We had no traceability or tracking of if these reports were even opened up and looked at, and any insights being even derived from this. So it was more of a hindsight-based view on our data. We'd never looked at what the insights were that were coming out of this data. It was more about, hey, I'm going to get you an Excel spreadsheet with 100,000 rows. Go figure out what you want to do with it, right? That was one of the challenges. The other piece of this on the analytical side was the mentality, the skill set within the organization, both on the business side as well as the technology side within my organization, needed to mature substantially for us to be able to deliver, looking at insights from a visual dashboard, looking at potentially even traversing up the curve to get to predictive analytics, to looking at AI and ML. Those were aspirational goals at that point in time, but our business was pushing us in that direction because they were looking at the marketplace, and we needed to adapt fairly quickly. The other two bottom challenges that we had was total cost of ownership. We were a landscape that, from a data perspective, we were a landscape that was on-prem. We had one big honking data appliance that we used for every single use case, right? That's where the bottleneck started, coming up, where the business wanted to run more data, more use cases. They needed to run operational reports, and also started looking at this cool thing called data science. And we had none of that capacity to be able to do that, right? So we had a very aging landscape that led to scalability and stability issues, right? Because we hit that same box with all of these different use cases, and the results are not always that great when you have a lot of queries running against one workload. So those were some of the challenges. If I look at the right-hand side, this then, where we needed to get from this was to the future state goals, which was in support of our 3-year plan. We had to enable top-line revenue growth. We had to look at how we sell more stuff at a better operating margin, reduce our costs, so our end-to-end cost to serve our customers goes down. And then we also had to look at an enterprise view of data. We never had a landscape where we had all of our data across our different lines of business, across our different functions and operating companies in one place, so that we could do some of the cool stuff around customer churn, around white space analysis. The business was actually asking us for all of these things. From a technology perspective, we weren't able to give them the solutions because of the technology constraints that we had with our landscape. So the enterprise view of data was one of the key tenets, if you will, as we looked at where we need to go to in the next 3 to 5 years. And all of this, Sysco is a company that has paper-thin margins. Every penny that we spend is extremely intently scrutinized. So to be able to do all of the cool stuff, all of this cool new stuff, faster, better, with more capability, but hey, you got to find the money to do it, right? No money is going to be allocated to this. Go figure out where you can offset costs and build this capability, and essentially start small and then grow from there. So that was our mantra overall. So there were 3 areas, right? We looked at the broader plan, where we looked at $500+ million in operating income that we had to get, plus the 15% ROIC. There were 3 key areas that the business identified and started pushing us on. These are the data needs that we have for achieving our goals. Catman is category management, where we looked at a broad swath of data for our items that we sell across different suppliers and customers, identify the most profitable ones, identify where we had leverage with those suppliers, and push those to our field sales representatives. We also had an auditability trail built out, so we did compliance reports, and these weren't row and column based, and I'll show you a slide really quickly here where we had Tableau kind of giving us visual representations of where our focus and where our business needs to kind of go. The second area was operational data insights. This directly impacted our cost to serve, if you will, our supply chain numbers, and impacted our operating costs. This was centered around figuring out efficiencies at our warehouse, figuring out driver efficiencies, how do we manage labor costs within the overall supply chain. We had tons of dashboards built out that provided insights fairly quickly to our warehouse managers, to our operating company presidents, that could then repurpose labor based on where the demand was fairly quickly, so that we served our customer at a lower cost. And the last piece of this was around our overall sales margins and revenue management. So revenue management is a stream of work that we launched a few years ago at Sysco, essentially focused on our pricing strategies and looking at our overall elasticity for pricing across different customer segments. For that, we needed data, right? And that's kind of the key component, the key ingredient of being able to come up with the insights that we need to be able to price at appropriate price points. So revenue management was another component of our overall data journey and the value that we had to deliver in the 3-year commitment to the street. So these are, again, I'm going to glean over these, but these are some of the dashboards that we developed. This was a quantum leap from where we were at Sysco 3 years ago. It gives you a flavor and a smattering of the dashboards that we built across the 3 tracks of work that you saw. There are a lot of other areas that use visual analytics at Sysco. These are the key ones that were in support of the plan that we had. One key call out, I'm not sure if the senior director that actually led the operational data insights work is here, but his call out in one of the presentations that he made that stuck with me was, it's all about 2 cents. It's all about the 2 cents per case that we need to find. And data and analytics is what we use to be able to get to that 2 cents, which gave us the goals that we had to achieve for the 3-year plan. So 2 call-outs on this slide. One is our data journey was 2 parts. One was getting the data and the insights to the business faster, as quickly as possible to achieve our plan, while we ran a technology-focused project that replumbed all of our data and built this new ecosystem that we needed so desperately to be able to support this. So we did not build these dashboards. We built all of the foundation first, and then kind of decided, hey, we're ready for the dashboards now. A lot of this was built in parallel, because we had to get to a point where the business actually realized the value while we were building the foundation for the overall data lake or the data ecosystem. So this is now the how, right? What did we do? From a technology perspective, we looked at this journey as a transformational journey rather than a technology replatform, right? We had to do this with the lens of the why for the business, because like I said, every penny matters at Sysco, so we had to convince our leadership that this was something that was going to get them top-line revenue growth, right, as well as impact our overall margins to get us better cost leverage with our suppliers and better prices for our customers. So I'm going to start on the left, and then the focus of the rest of the sessions around the technology, but the people component of this was extremely important. We were a heavily outsourced organization, right? A lot of the folks that I inherited when I started in the role were behind the curtain somewhere offshore. We did not have direct access to them. The folks that were at Sysco were few and far between. We did not really have a whole lot of data expertise with the Sysco landscape. The first thing we did was start looking at insourcing some of those key and strategic roles, right? We had to look at getting the right skills on the ground to be able to support our journey. So that's what we did first up. The second piece of it was we had to upskill our resources as well. A lot of the resources that we had on the ground wouldn't be able to kind of play a critical, pivotal role as a SME, both in the data space or the technology space, as we transition to this new data ecosystem. So we did both. We did a little bit of strategic insourcing. Again, this wasn't en masse. We didn't cut off the cord with all of our support vendors. We did pick and choose the right strategic roles where we thought there was a secret sauce that Sysco needed to own. We pulled those in to the company, and then the rest of it we continue to maintain and manage within our support vendors. The second piece of it, and I think Greg alluded to this, was data and insights is an extremely flexible, agile kind of delivery method, right? Data changes all the time, insights change all the time. And given the fact that Sysco was morphing and changing based on market conditions at that point in time, we had to now change our delivery methodology too. We call ourselves business technology. We don't call ourselves IT at Sysco, because we are there to support the business, and I think that's a key tenet that we follow. One of the things that I noticed when I got to Sysco was we had this whole SDLC waterfall delivery cycle, even with data. I'm sure some of you guys have experienced this, right? And it never goes wrong. It's all the best things that we do. We sign off on a piece of paper with the business, say, hey, this is the report and the dashboard and the insight that I need. And 3 months later, the business says, hey, thank you, awesome work, great job. Everything I told you was built, right? Never happens, right? So that's why we started looking at transforming the process itself as well, and look at the delivery methodology of being a little more agile. So we restructured the entire team. And the way that we work now is we sit with the business, we partner with the business, and again, this is not pervasively done across all functions yet, but that's the goal. We're getting there. A lot of the critical functions that you saw earlier have been changed to Agile though, right? So we sit with the business, we have regular cadence of meetings, we have bi-weekly delivery, so 2-week sprints. The business shows up to our showcases, and I'll be honest, we had challenges in the overall process, right? The business was, hey, BT never delivers because it's going to take you 3 months. I'm not going to show up for the showcase. But the ones that did, we actually delivered for them, right? And the proof is in the pudding. Once you actually deliver for them, you start building traction, and success breeds success. Everybody else noticed that and was like, hey, I want that too. So we started off with 2 teams that were agile. We now have 8 teams in my organization that are working with the business closely to deliver value. So that was another key tenet. Being agile is also about having the technology that can be agile, right? Because some of the automation needs, you can't really push on legacy landscapes. So we have that component of the equation, if you will, that we had to influence a technology decision. So if I look at that technology block, one of the things that we did, and there are a few slides in the deck later here that talk about the why of the technology and our as-is landscape. But when we looked at technology, we looked across a broad swath of capabilities that was available in the marketplace. Greg alluded to Hadoop. He alluded to various different technologies that were quote-unquote potentials for being a data lake, right? We looked at Hadoop, which had capabilities that could support our top-end spectrum, data science activities, broader scale, but then it lacked in structured reporting, right? We had to look across that whole spectrum of capability to come up with what our answer was. And that's where we picked AWS, because it wasn't just, hey, I can provide you in a teaser box with all of the structured data warehouse reporting that you can get, or I can provide you a Hadoop that can give you all the data science and scale that you need. We needed all of it and then some, right? So that's where we picked AWS, because it had components that Greg articulated that support a broad swath of use cases. So that's how AWS was picked. And I'll give you 3 reasons, right? Our capability map was fairly broad. AWS could support it. The innovation pace at AWS was fairly quick and fast. A lot of the stuff that they came up with, we were thinking about why doesn't it do this, and they already had it in the hopper and it was available. Stuff like Spectrum, we were talking about it, 6 months ago, and we had it available now. So things that move really fast, it was important to us because this landscape changes ever so often. To be able to keep up the pace of innovation, these guys are doing a great job. And then the last component, like I told you, we are extremely cost sensitive. The cost leverage that we had with moving to AWS was substantial. I mean, the business case was substantial. We could add all of the capability and then some and still be under the numbers that we wanted to be at. So that was a technology lens. I'm going to take a sip of my water here if you guys don't mind. So this slide is interesting. If I look at our usage patterns at Sysco, what we did when we started off understanding what we did and where we wanted to be, this was one of the things that we pulled together at the very get-go. We were a very hindsight-focused organization. So this was our capability maturity about 2.5, 3 years ago when we started the journey. Like I told you, we had hundreds of thousands of reports that were being sent out. No idea if someone actually even clicked on those reports or did anything with it, right? And then we had parameterized reporting, bunch of things that we said we have the system called Information Central. It's got a lot of data, but the information, I don't know if it's really useful. So those were the 2 first components. We then kind of moved up the curve. We had a guided ad hoc tool that we used, essentially running queries where we had exploratory kind of analysis as well as visual dashboards. The size of the blocks, guys, depicts how much of it we did, right? So we were a lot more hindsight, a lot more formatted row and column reporting, a lot less up at the top of the curve. So that's where we decided, hey, we need to be able to address this whole spectrum of needs and start moving up that curve, right? And that's where AWS kind of stepped in, and we decided to go down the journey of this data lake. So cue the drum roll. This is what we built out, right? It's called SEED. It's an acronym for Cisco's enterprise, Cisco's ecosystem for enterprise data. And it was extremely important for us to start this journey and the overall change in the business around this with a branding exercise, because I didn't want people in the business to start thinking about, hey, am I going to go to Redshift, or am I going to go to EMR, or am I going to use Glue, or am I going to use Tableau? The whole idea behind this was we had a cohesive strategy and branding across this whole data ecosystem that we were building. So see it again, it's an AWS-based ecosystem, and it's an ecosystem, not an enterprise data warehouse. It has various different components inside of it that support all of the use cases, the swath of use cases that you see. A key component of Seed, Greg alluded to this, is S3. It has all of our data being landed in one spot, so that essentially becomes our data lake, and from there on in, we pick where that data set goes. So there's data that goes into operational reporting, use cases for Redshift. There's data science activities that we can stand up analytical sandboxes for with additional compute capacity, and that's where Seed kind of helped us address that broad swath of use cases. Hitting on a few of those bullets there, right? It's demand-driven. We can stand up instances when we need them. Month closes, we can actually scale up the resources. If the business wants to test out a hypothesis in the data science space, we can stand up an analytical sandbox based on the S3 data we have available. All we need to do is turn on additional compute with EMR to be able to give them access to that data and prove out a particular use case. So this gave us a lot more flexibility. So why did we go there? This slide kind of is a little out of place, but the context of this is I wanted to tell you guys that the bottleneck that we had in our landscape was this one big box, right? Every single thing, there are a few people cringing in the audience because they live it, I think. The left part of this equation is fairly simplified. It's a 50,000-foot view, if not a 100,000-foot view. We've got about 500 systems on the left that feed into this one box. And we have a mixed load scenario, right? We've got everybody and their brother on Monday mornings trying to run a query. We've got people trying to load in data, and it just doesn't work. It's that one box trying to do all of this and then some. We have data extracts that data scientists are running. We have ETL accounts. And that's where we needed to kind of break the workload out, right? The mixed workload had to be serviced through different components in the landscape. That's where Seed helped us. And this is what we ended up with. Again, I said ended up with, not started with. We started off with small components of this overall landscape. So if you look at the side, on the left side, this is all of the data feeds that we get. And then there's 6 boxes or 5 boxes in the middle part of what's called Seed, right? What we do, ingestion, we didn't really change a whole lot on our ingestion side yet. We use Informatica primarily for that. And as you guys probably know from a data warehousing background, ETL and ELT are the most complicated things to change about a data warehouse, right? We have to get that right. In order for us to be able to unhook some of that and get some value, we started looking at other alternatives. We are looking at AWS Glue yet. It's one of our next phases. But we also looked at EMR. The challenge that we had, guys, was when we load data every week, we adjust data for a large time window for our PO costs and our overall cost to serve every week. So we have to go back and look at quantums of data to be able to adjust it. That was one of the biggest bottlenecks that our ETL, Informatica, and Netezza weren't able to handle. So what we did is we looked at what those big ticket items were and offloaded those to compute-intensive environments like Amazon EMR. So instead of us processing everything in this tier, we stood up EMR clusters on the fly to be able to do those ETL processing, and we did offload everything there. So we are not hitting our operational data warehouse now for those ETLs. So that's why it's an ecosystem that addresses different needs at different points in time. So if I look up at the top there, the storage layer essentially is Amazon S3. We land every single thing in S3. We create reportable data. We do our ETLs. We also push back to S3, and I'll tell you in a minute why. They're both reportable and transformed data. And then we have Redshift on the extreme right there, which is our analyze and operational data warehouse layer. We push data back to S3 because there are downstream consuming use cases that would actually hit Netezza to get large volumes and globs of data. If I calculate a metric like our net cost, for example, right? There was a query that was hit by 5 different systems hitting our operational data warehouse to get that metric back out. Instead of us doing that, we offloaded those big batch jobs from the operational data warehouse into S3, right? So you can hit S3 and then extract that data out. So none of the operational data insights that the users are interacting with will get affected. So that architecture is in place as well. The second component down there is ETL. I talked about EMR. We also use Lambda and serverless architecture to be able to process transformations. We use data pipeline for staging. We are looking at Glue, as I said. That'll probably be a key cornerstone of our go-forward catalog strategy, too. And then at the bottom, you see CloudTrail and CloudWatch. They are our monitoring solutions. If you guys are familiar with AWS, those are plug and play as well with a lot of the AWS services and components. Not to drain the slide completely, but on the extreme right is the analyze layer, and they are use case based. So the primary operational data warehouse is Redshift, right? So our Tableau environments, our business objects environments, our internal reporting needs that are still being burst out. We haven't got away from report bursting yet, but we're starting to move up the curve and reduce the size of the box that we have for reporting is all coming out of that tier there. And then on the right, you see business objects and Tableau, which are our 2 primary consumption tools today. I kind of talked about this a little bit, so I might skip this, but I'll give you a couple of highlights on this. So ecosystem versus EDW, what this essentially means, guys, is when we started off our journey, it was a replacement for Netezza. We had to find something that was better, faster, cheaper than Netezza. But what we quickly realized was that we had such a broad swath of use cases across our business needs that an enterprise data warehouse wasn't going to cut it. We had to build an ecosystem that was fit for use case, right? It had to be an architecture that supported all of these use cases, and that's where we kind of shifted our overall strategy. So focus, again, was user value and what we wanted to activate. What was our cost optimization? One of the key things we learned along the journey was the fact that with cloud, you have to make a mind shift of cost is not only upfront CapEx that you buy a particular appliance with. For example, if I buy Netezza, it's X million dollars, right? I have an upfront cost. I got to go to IBM, procure that, or Oracle for that matter, and procure that appliance, and I have an upfront cost. And that's the capacity that I bought, and I'm locked in, right? Whereas when you go to the cloud, the mentality has to shift now to optimizing forever. What that means is I put everything in the cloud. I can buy the biggest and baddest, but that's not what I'm locked into, right? As I optimize, as I grow, I can use the levers to go up or go down. My cost can be optimized over time. So that was a really key lesson, and I think Greg alluded to it in his slides as well. So that was one of the key observations. We continue to optimize, but what this tells us and what this gives us is I can give my business value up front without saying, hey, I wait for all of this to be refined and be the best and all of the devices to land in my on-prem data center before I go activate value for you. This gives me the flexibility in the shortest lead time possible. And then reliability and accuracy, right? Now that we've got data in one place, we don't have all of the interpretations, multiple interpretations of the metrics, the data, and the insights that we're getting. We have that one repository where we go and look at value and accuracy across that. So we have, again, we've got a ways to go before we have governance across all of our metrics, but this gives us the framework and the foundation to be able to do that. So this is where we ended up. A lot of the stuff that was pie in the sky a couple of years ago for us across these different functions, I'm not going to, you guys can read the list, but all of these different things that were really cool and the business wanted to do and we weren't able to do, we can run all of this today in our environments, right? And looking at those use cases, we can stand up all of the analytical sandboxes. It's quicker time to market. You can explore the data sets that you have before you go say, hey, this is where I'm going to invest my dollars that particular financial year to be able to get benefit, right? So this gives us the foundation, the technology foundation to support the business across all of these functions. And these are just some of them. There are obviously other functions and other lines of business that we are working with as well to identify better segmentation and value. So as we did that, right, we did our first cut at this is what seed was. One of the things we quickly realized was optimization forever. I think I said that in my previous slide. What were the opportunities that we had to start tweaking and tuning the right kind of thing? So initially when we started off the project and the work, the lens was I have to get off of Netezza, right? We had 3 big honking devices that we paid millions of dollars for. We had to get off of those boxes and derive some value. So what we did first is looked at, hey, let's switch off one of these boxes. What's the subject area that we can switch off, move to the cloud, gain some value in terms of dollars offset, as well as skills and experience, right? Because AWS and the technologies that we were going to was extremely new to the team, to the organization, and the way to work in that environment was extremely different as well. So this gave us an opportunity to continually improve. One of the things we found, and this is not something that's rocket science, but what we noticed is that all of our lower use cases, the low-hanging fruit where the users had interactions and were suffering from performance challenges, were in the BO and Tableau space. How do we better that experience? What we did is offloaded all of the red stuff off of Redshift and kept only the user interactive workbooks and BobJ reports on Redshift. The rest of it was moved to something else. It was either EMR or Athena running on S3, or we had serverless Lambda calls that were doing all of the other stuff, right? So that's how we continually improve. Even some of the reports that we have in BobJ are really large right now. So as we continually look at this, there might be things that move off of Redshift directly into other components on the ecosystem. So it's a journey that we're on, and I don't think there's a finish to it. It's an iterative journey that we keep refining our overall landscape. And I'd be remiss, I'm at the Tableau conference. I wanted to make sure I put in a few slides for Tableau as well. This slide kind of depicts our Tableau journey. We've grown exponentially over the last I want to say 3 to 4 years. Some of the things that we ran into with Tableau was the fact that the scale of the overall solution was creating performance bottlenecks for us. The amount of data that we were using in Tableau sometimes created performance challenges, and then adoption and change management was a big stumbling block. So what we did is we proactively started looking at usage patterns and which functions were using Tableau the most effectively. And if there were performance challenges that we saw on the horizon, we actively engaged those analysts. The Tableau workbooks were refined. Some of the Tableau folks actually helped us look at code refinements as well as opportunities to restructure those workbooks. We have an ongoing commitment from Tableau that they come in about 6 to 8 to 12 months, look at our overall landscape, help us through optimization opportunities. So it's a proactive monitoring process, and we've grown substantially, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, on our Tableau landscape as well. I'll skip that one. That kind of talks about our EC2 instances, but I'll skip the next one. Actually gives you a feel for the numbers. We started off in 2014 with a very small POC on Tableau. We had 16 CPUs on-prem at that point in time, but it caught on like wildfire. The initial dashboards that you saw, screenshots of with category management, ODI, and some of the sales stuff that we did, it was extremely well received by our business, and we had to quickly start scaling up. So we scaled up on-prem in 2015 to about 40 cores, and then realized that instead of us having to buy machines just like we were looking at AWS for our overall seed ecosystem, we started looking at what our journey would look like if we moved to AWS and what the lead times could be shortened to if we started moving all of our Tableau servers in AWS. 2016 is when we moved everything up there, moved from 80 vCPUs at that point in time to now about 3 times or, about 4 times from 2015 the size. We are about 200 vCPUs now. We've got scale and capacity in the environment today that can support about 12,000 users concurrently, active users. And that's a substantial increase in adoption, which has given us value for the business. So it's not just Tableau because it's cool, it's also driving value for the business. All right, so I'll kind of finish off with this slide. Benefits of seed on AWS, right? So if I look at the spectrum of things that we did, we have improved capability, right? We weren't able to do a lot of the stuff that you saw on that maturity curve of analytics. We can do all of it and then some. We're starting to look at AI and ML capabilities now. I'll come to governance in a second here. The second piece of it was better cost leverage, right? We pay probably about 75% of what we paid for our existing landscape, but we have a ton more capability, and that 75% is just a starting point, right? We can still refine, pull the right levers, and if there's value coming out of that ecosystem, we can turn those dials up to be able to get more of it, but there's value associated with it. Scalability and availability to meet our business needs. We never had HA and DR in our landscape. We had performance and scale challenges. We are able to do all of that with AWS. Security, Greg alluded to, it's already built in on the platform. It's one of the most secure platforms out there. And for the business, some of the things that we weren't able to do with testing before implementation, with analytical sandboxes, try out what you want to prove out before you put it out there. We can do all of that. The last dimension is governance. We have a framework for technology governance already built in and starting to be adopted and rolled out. The second dimension of that is governance across all of our functional areas for metrics management, making sure our sales guys, our supply chain guys, and our revenue management guys are talking to each other about the right metric and in the right sense. That's the next piece of it, but we have this landscape that now has data in one place that can help get us there. So that's my time. I'm going to hand it back to Greg, and then we'll kind of take questions right at the end, right?
Yep. So I just have one, oftentimes we get asked, like, that sounds great, but what can I do to start, right? And I just wanted to call out, I think you'll have access to these, but it's actually super simple if you wanted to test out using Tableau and Redshift or Tableau in our analytics services, right? We have quick start guides. We've got a ton of material in terms of just experimentation. And I think like the guidance I would have, particularly if you're new to AWS, like just try it, right? I mean, you can, get your personal credit card. We have 1 year free tier, and just start building, right? And what we want to think about is like, hey, let's not answer this RFP or do a lot of analysis. Like, just go build something, right? And this is really, hopefully we make it easy in terms of adoption, but this is really the way to kind of like max up your use case. And another piece of not just saying, build it and test it, but the other great thing is to say, look, if it doesn't work, turn it off, right? And if you've kind of seen some of the press or media around, Amazon culture and this idea of how do we drive innovation and this idea of experimentation and not just making success, super valuable, but making failure super low risk, right? And it's this iterative approach of don't do a bunch of analysis. I mean, do some due diligence, sure, but just test it, right? And hopefully there's some resources that can kind of help get started as well. So having said that, I think we've got a few minutes left, so we wanted to kind of, have questions or, okay. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. There we go.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
So my company's data is all stored inside Salesforce, and connecting Tableau to that has been challenging because we're trying to move towards a real-time analytics or near real-time analytics.
Yep.
So I've talked to AWS, and our idea is to use the DMS connector from Salesforce into S3, and then go from S3 via Athena to Tableau.
Yep.
So with that said, what would be your recommendation as far as optimization or Tableau optimization is concerned with that route versus using DMS into Redshift and then running Tableau in the cloud?
Yep. So the first is that, we think about data on S3, like the value of like loading into Redshift is that Redshift is a database and it has a file format, right? S3 is not a database, right? So this sounds like intuitive, but like, we spend time, like S3 is not a database, right? It's an object store. And the file format matters significantly for performance. And this is why, I'm not sure like what the file format, but like thinking about Parquet, right? Whether using Glue or whatever ecosystem to then make it in that Parquet format, right? And that'll be like one, it's less cost because it's terabyte scanned, right? Not processed. And two, you'll get like 100x better performance, from the queries itself by Parquet. I mean, your numbers might vary, right? Now, when I want to say, okay, like you think about, and I kind of explained this, that we think of Athena as a super simple way, serverless architecture to explore data, right? Where maybe the data fundamentally is at rest, and I'm not doing things I do in a data warehouse, like saying I've got Salesforce data, Marketo data, like POS data, I want to do like joins and like the cost-based optimizer and sort of this like performance that Redshift offers, right? So what I see customers doing is let's start with Athena because it's simple. I can start understanding the value of the data. When you start hearing things like, hey, this is great, but I want to combine it with these other sources, or I want to have the value of the local disk to drive even better performance, that's where Redshift kind of comes into play, right? But now since I'm leveraging the same data catalog, moving from Athena to Redshift Spectrum or to Redshift itself is simply as create table as select. Right? And now you're in a local Redshift table, right? And so, it's not, I don't necessarily think it's like either or, but certainly there's some overlap in the middle, but kind of thinking about this data warehouses use cases versus data discovery, and just from the ease of use and sort of like ability to move fast, I see a lot of customers starting with Athena just for that purpose, yeah? Make sense, yeah?
Naveen, this question is for you. What was the first project that Sysco moved to the cloud that provided value? What was your prototype system that actually, provided value?
So this was one of them, right? So Seed was one of our first projects. Now you're making me think. So we actually did a couple of cloud migrations, just lift and shifts. But you probably know this lift and shifts is not going to really get you value because you're not restructuring to use the advantage of the cloud. And that's where we started saying, hey, cloud is, this whole tagline of cloud is cheaper wasn't really proven in those cases because lift and shift is all you're doing is taking horsepower from here and moving it up into the cloud. So you typically don't see value coming out of it. This project where we actually saw restructuring of what we did and how we did it was one of the key first success stories, if you will, on the cloud for Sysco.
Yeah. And I think this is one sentence, following it. Remember that, like, you can go and provision a massive Redshift cluster, right? And if you have a massive data warehouse on premise, it seems, I'll just move there and everything will be good. Well, like, why would you do that? Like, yes, like, come talk to me. I'd love to talk about your petabyte data warehouse, but maybe that's not the best approach because the access patterns align to kind of what Naveen called out that could be different, right? Yeah.
Naveen, our company also uses business objects in Tableau for data retrieval, and I was just wondering, seems like business objects is still part of your data delivery. How do you see those two working together or differentiated? What purposes do you use each for?
We should exchange notes offline and maybe talk about this too. Because again, we are looking at where the use cases overlap, and they do, right? We've got to figure out what a strategy for Bob J is longer term. My goal, again, from a cost perspective, is to look at other alternatives for business objects and figure out where we go on scalable solutions with Bob J. Like, it's not Bob J is not a system that can scale to the cloud. It's server-based architecture that actually does not let you take advantage of cost and scale in the cloud. But the business users, a lot of them love Bob J for what they use it for. So there's a change management component to it, but there's also some feel for, we can give them something better. We've looked at Tableau for guided ad hoc use cases as well. Interestingly, and you guys probably have tried this as well, performance is not the best with larger ad hoc queries that you build on Tableau. But there are other tools, QuickSights is one of them that we'll be potentially looking at as well. So longer term, Bob J may be something that we start looking at unplugging and giving the users a better tool to work with.
And in full disclosure, I worked for Business Objects for 2 years, and my premier account was Sysco 10 years ago. So Naveen always gets the it's like you're not me personally, but yeah. Anyhow. So be careful what you position, because you never know in the future. Yeah.
So Amazon provides a lot of options. How do you manage which tool to use for what? Because then
Yep.
You have many ways to skin a cat.
Yep. I think, my answer to that is like it's the use case or business case that drives it, right? Like if you think about picking the technology, like we missed the boat somewhere, right? And I know it's easy to say, hey, think about the use case. I mean, everybody's, think about the use case. But what I mean is like you're not, one experiment, right? And don't go into it thinking that Redshift is going to solve all problems, right? Because it's not, right? And so this experimentation and like matching that to the actual need. So the example that Naveen kind of went through is, hey, they're doing all these large data extracts through BI tools, right? Maybe that's S3 better way, right? And so this iterative approach, I mean, I don't know if there's like a magic bullet on, just do this, but it has to start with like what's the business problem or use case we're trying to solve, right? And then matching that using reference architectures, customer examples, working with AWS to kind of like define what that architecture looks like. And what I wouldn't do is, hey, let's spend a lot of analysis figuring out if I should use EMR, Redshift, or Athena, right? Yeah. But I don't know, Naveen, if you have a thought.
Technology council, I don't have the mic on me, but we have a technology council that actually looks at the use case and figures out which components we use. So we have identified which slivers of capability are enabled by which component in our landscape. And then any net new capability or use case that comes in, we push it through our technology governance landscape to make sure we're building it on the right place. So that's important.
Yeah.
Hey, Naveen, this question is for you. Fabulous journey and forward architecture thinking, right? So pretty good, So my question is, I saw you have a very, very good data management strategy, and also you started your Tableau journey in the year of 2014. Where exactly you started your rethinking your data management strategy? Because the reason I'm asking is, most of the Tableau, folks bringing the Tableau, they're never thinking of the data strategy.
Well, that's a very, very good question, I think. Like I said, I think I mentioned it on a couple of slides. We had a two-pronged approach, right? One was getting business the value that they needed fast. Tableau was able to get us there, right? Tableau, Bob J were able to get us there because we did some quote-unquote manual data munging before we had the broader seed platform available. To your question, when we started looking at Tableau in 2014, 2016, one of the things we quickly realized was that all of the manual stuff that we were doing across all of our fragmented data systems was not going to scale. We'd need tons of people to be able to support that, and then accuracy and automation was just not going to be possible, right? And the cost to serve was only going to go, it was going to hockey stick up, right? As we added more systems, we've grown through acquisition, right? As we added more systems, more companies, we'd not be able to sustain doing those manual data pushes out tools like Tableau longer term. And the other flip was that performance would suck if we didn't have the right kind of technology foundation for the data built out. That was the primary driver. So our journey for Tableau, I would say, started in earnest in 2015. And quickly after that, about 2016 is when we started looking at, hey, we need to really replumb this whole thing. the lipstick on the pig wouldn't really work, right? So that's where we started looking at the overall data foundation changes.
One more quick question.
Yes, sir.
The journey between you, Sysco, and AWS and Amazon. Do you have any partnerships?
With Cisco and AWS? Well, we use their consulting arm to, for the architecture and the components that they build, because a lot of the stuff that my guys wouldn't even know about, I reach out to Greg and his team to kind of help us think through. Then we have an implementation partner as well.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I was going to come to you, and I'll come to you right after.
Hey, I think this question is for both of you guys. Like this cloud transformation initiative, how did you handle the people and the process aspect of it? Like,
Yeah.
how did you convince your traditional IT folks that cloud is the thing? And that's kind of the pain point we are having at Bloomberg, is that they are like really used to on-premise stuff.
Right,
and
right.
Like we have our cloud era
Yeah, so I spent
distribution.
probably like, I don't know, 60% maybe, but some large percentage of my time having this exact conversation, And I think so the example I use is FINRA. So I've been with AWS. In AWS terms, it's like forever. It's like over 4 years, right? And first conversation with FINRA, the first 10 conversations was like, EC2 doesn't support rack. I can't do this. And then this is kind of an extreme example, but one day I didn't talk to those people anymore, and it was how fast can we move, right? And I think, but in reality, it's kind of a more humorous kind of it's actually true, but humorous. But really, I think what happens is what drives it is, to Naveen's kind of point, is look, there's a business objective. We've got to we made a commitment to the street, right? You've got to take the cost and let that drive it, right? And then to IT professionals, what I say is, look, the cloud journey is happening. You can debate, is it Google, is it Amazon, is it Microsoft? Probably all three, right, and more. So if you personally don't take responsibility, the world is changing, right? And this is your chance to be a leader in that, right? And whether it's just having your own personal account or being part of a project, but the idea that I'm just going to bury my head in the sand probably is not best choice, right? And so how do we provide incentives to learn something new? Now that's easy to say, a little bit harder to implement. I get it, but if you kind of have it's not necessarily the CEO down, but some business driver and some piece, right? So how did Amazon change, right? Amazon changed because in 2005, our world's largest Oracle rack cluster restarted at holiday time, right? And it was this kind of famous story now if you look out there. And so this was compelling event, right? And today, we don't run too much Oracle, right? And because we thought about how putting all of our eggs in one basket for our own business, right? And all these services that we talk about, you can use them, but this is exactly how Amazon retail runs, right? So.
We take two more. I think we have one question there and one here, right?
Did you have to bring talent from outside
absolutely.
on AWS and cloud architecture?
Absolutely.
Yep.
If you don't do that, then you're kind of missing the boat on
Yep.
what you can change and transform.
Yep. And on that piece, if you go to our big data web at AWS, we have this big data competency where consulting partners have shown us they've done consulting with successfully, right? And it's not at the end of the day, then who shows up, that kind of discussion, but just knowing that, hey, everyone's going to tell you I can do that, right? Just have a little caution. Maybe they can, maybe they can't, but at least knowing there's this competency certification helps, with that consulting piece, yeah.
A question for Naveen. You had alluded to a weekly refresh cycle, multiple stages. Did you encounter any challenges sort of setting and implementing those SLAs and sort of expectations for how fresh data is, and have you tried to speed that up closer to real time?
Yes, so absolutely. So one of the things, the key tenets of moving to the cloud was the fact that we'd get data faster, quicker, and more accurate. We still have refresh cycles at a week and even monthly in some cases, but we've started to look at real-time data because a lot of the stuff that we do with analog sensors on our trucks, in our warehouse, that's streaming data that we can now start piping into Seed and starting to look at more frequent updates. So we're getting there. The foundation from a technology perspective is there. The longer lead time in my mind for those use cases is business process change, right? Because now I have to start talking to my business about, hey, you have more data available right now. What are you going to do with it, right? And sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's a longer change management lead time to be able to get them to adopt and think through what they're going to do with the real-time data. It's not about real-time data for real-time data's sake, right? We've got to figure out those use cases.
Do individual consumers of data have some sort of expectation set for when they should expect their data, and how do you sort of manage that across the organization?
So we do. So typically, users in category management, for example, one of the key areas, they have a weekly refresh of the data because we have to adjust, because it's a business process thing. It's nothing to do with the technology, because we hit our PO costs by the end of Saturday. We adjust everything on a Saturday, and then we have a hindsight view on everything that's been done in the past. So that's kind of a weekly cadence for them. They're okay with it. But our sales, for example, our field sales guys, for example, they today get a hindsight view of, hey, what was ordered yesterday? We're now able to give them a view of, hey, what's being ordered right now? How do we reallocate across our different tiers of customers? All of that's potentially available from a tech perspective now. You just got to figure out the business process around it. Last one, you good?
Okay.
Awesome.
All right, thanks,
Thank you guys, appreciate all that.
My last advertisement at 3 o'clock, we have hands-on workshop where if you